My name is Elena Graves. I'm 30 now. I live in Maryland and work as a family law attorney. But this story doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins long before I knew what justice meant. It begins the moment I saw Cheryl Andrews walk into our house 2 weeks after we buried my mother. That day, my father looked me in the eye and said, "If you've got a problem with her living here, you can leave." Then he did something I'll never forget. He held the front door open and waited. I was 16. I didn't have a suitcase. I didn't even have socks on. But I walked out. The rain had just started. I remember the smell of wet grass and cheap cologne. I remember looking back one last time and seeing them, my father and his new woman, standing in the hallway where my mother used to hum and fold laundry. And I remember wondering, how do people replace a wife that fast? How do you replace a mother before the flowers on her grave have even wilted? It took me years to come back. But when I did, I wasn't alone. And I didn't come back for closure. I didn't come back to forgive anyone. I came back because someone else was asking for help. And that someone was the very woman who took my mother's place. The house I grew up in sat at the edge of a red clay road in rural North Carolina. From the outside, it looked still white shutters, a creaky porch swing, and an old oak tree that shaded the front yard like a watchful parent. But inside that house, everything was waiting to break. My father, Gerald Graves, was a large man, not just in size, but in presence. He was a former Army mechanic discharged early for reasons no one ever said out loud. He walked like he owned the air in the room, and when he was angry, even the furniture leaned away. My mother, Marla, had once been a music teacher. When I was little, I used to watch her hands dance across the piano. By the time I was 6, the piano was gone, sold to cover bills. Her hands were quiet after that, except when they reached for me. The first time he hit me, I had spilled milk at dinner. A dumb mistake. I was only 6. The glass tipped and soaked the tablecloth my mother had just ironed. He stared at me like I had cursed in church. "You think this is your house," he said, and then came the slap. I don't remember the pain. Just the sound, the plate clattering off the table, my mother's chair scraping back, and then her voice shaking. "She's just a child, Gerald." He pushed her away. She hit the wall behind the fridge. She didn't cry. She only looked at me. That night, she sat beside me in bed, dabbing a cold washcloth on my cheek. Her voice was low when she said it. "Elena, sometimes people who are supposed to protect you don't know how." She wasn't making excuses. She was warning me. From that night on, I knew this was not a house with accidents. This was a house with patterns, and patterns don't fix themselves. When my sister Lacey was born, I was 8. She came into the world with soft fingers, a high, clear cry, and a smile that seemed to make my mother breathe again. But something else shifted too. My father, this man who threw dinner plates when I coughed too loud, he changed. Not completely. But around Lacey, he was gentle. He called her my little light. He held her like she was spun from glass. He never raised his voice, never scolded her, not once. And for a while, I was grateful. I told myself, good. At least he won't ruin her the way he ruined Mom. Or me. But as the months passed, I began to disappear. It started with small things. If Lacey cried and I was in the room, he'd look at me first. If something broke, I was the one who should have been watching. One night, I accidentally knocked over her stuffed giraffe. It hit the floor, barely made a sound. She didn't even notice, but he did. He slapped me so hard, I stumbled into the hallway. "You make your sister cry again, and you'll wish you hadn't." That night, I sat in the corner of my room holding the giraffe. I wasn't angry at Lacey. She was just a baby. But I remember thinking, what did she get that I didn't? What did I do wrong to be the one he couldn't love? My mother found me there sitting in the dark. She didn't ask what happened. She just held me and whispered, "I love you both, but I know. It doesn't always feel like that." It didn't. And the older I got, the more it felt like I was just someone they had before they got it right. By the time I turned 14, my mother was fading. Not physically, she still cooked dinner, still packed Lacey's school lunches with a sticky note smile, but her spirit. It was thinning. She stopped humming, stopped wearing earrings, stopped sitting under the oak tree with me in the evening. I'd come home from school and find her sitting at the kitchen table staring into cold tea like it might finally say something comforting. "Mom?" I'd ask. She'd blink. Force a smile. "I'm okay, Elena, just tired." But she was always tired. And when you live in a house like that, tired can mean something worse. The arguments between my parents got louder, sharper. They didn't fight about money anymore. They fought about someone else. A name I didn't recognize at first. Cheryl. "You think I don't know?" my mother shouted one night. "You think I don't hear you whispering on the porch like some teenager?" My father didn't deny it. He just rolled his eyes and went for another drink. That was the first time I saw my mother punch the wall. Her knuckles bruised the next morning, hidden under a dish towel. Later that week, I found a folded pamphlet in her drawer. It was from a local shelter. On the cover, "Domestic Abuse, Know the Signs." That's when I started writing everything down. The dates he came home drunk, the bruises he left behind, the things he said when he thought no one was listening. I didn't know what I was building. Maybe I thought if I kept the truth somewhere safe, I could make it matter one day. But even then, I was starting to wonder if I was already too late. Because the look in my mother's eyes wasn't fear anymore. It was surrender. And surrender in a house like ours doesn't always mean giving up. Sometimes it means disappearing before someone else takes that choice from you. It happened on a Tuesday. October. Cloudy. The kind of day where nothing feels solid under your feet. I was late getting home from school, stayed back at the library to finish an essay. The house was quiet when I walked in. No TV, no pots clanging, no Lacey singing to her dolls. Just my father on the couch, staring at the wall, an empty bottle on the carpet. He looked at me like I was interrupting something. "Your mother fell down the stairs," he said flatly. "She's at the hospital, that was all. Not, she's hurt, not, we need to go." Just a headline, dry, cold. "What, how?" I asked, stepping forward. His face tightened. "She fell?" he snapped, standing up. "That's all, don't start." He shoved past me and reached for his coat. "I need more whiskey." I ran, didn't even grab my bag. Just ran the 5 blocks to the emergency room. Lacey was sitting in the waiting area, legs swinging off a plastic chair, clutching her doll. Her eyes were red. When she saw me, she burst into tears. "Mom won't wake up." A nurse led me in. My mother lay in the bed like a stranger, still pale, her arms covered in purplish bruises. But it was the mark along her neck that froze me. A faint line, like a thumbprint pressed too hard. The doctor said it was a catastrophic head injury. She must have fallen backward, hit the stairs wrong. They did everything they could. She didn't make it. I remember touching her hand. It was still warm. And in that moment, I thought if I stayed completely still, maybe I could keep her with me. Maybe if I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't break, the world would pause too. But it didn't. The funeral was held 4 days later. My father wore a wrinkled shirt and smelled like he hadn't bathed. He didn't cry, didn't speak to me or Lacey. The neighbors came, whispered. One of them hugged me too long and said, "If you ever need anything." But no one said what we all knew, that my mother hadn't just fallen, that someone pushed her, maybe not with hands, but with years of cruelty, and that whatever happened at the top of those stairs, it wasn't an accident. Not really. But I had no proof, only a notebook full of bruises no one wanted to read, and a little sister who still whispered "Mom" in her sleep. 2 weeks after the funeral, I walked into our house and smelled perfume, not the kind my mother used to wear. Hers was soft powdery like pressed lilacs. This was sharper, synthetic, cheap. Cheryl was in the kitchen, wearing my mother's apron, pouring iced tea like she'd lived there all along. My father stood next to her, beer in hand belly resting on the counter like nothing had ever happened. He didn't look at me when he said it. "This is Cheryl. She'll be living here now." I stared at him, then at her. She smiled like someone who had already won something. "You can't be serious," I whispered. "Mom's only been gone." "You don't tell me what I can and can't do in my own house," he snapped. When I didn't move, he stepped closer. "If you've got a problem with her, you can get out." He opened the door and waited, No one yelled. No one cried. Not even Lacey. She was in the living room, knees tucked to her chest, clutching her doll like it might protect her. I walked out with nothing but the clothes on my back and my school bag half zipped. No jacket, no toothbrush, no plan. Just the wind and that perfume clinging to my lungs. I didn't look back until I reached the sidewalk. And even then, the only thing I saw was the porch light flicking on like I'd never been part of that house to begin with. I spent that night under the metal awning of a closed gas station. It rained. I used my backpack as a pillow, and sometime around 3 a.m., I whispered to the dark sky, "I think he killed her." No one answered, but I wasn't expecting anyone to, because by then I already knew in that house some people were replaceable, and some people were just in the way. I spent the night on a park bench near the grocery store where I used to bag apples after school. My jacket was still hanging on the hook by the door I'd been shoved out of. I didn't sleep much, just stared at the sky and waited for morning like it owed me something. By dawn, my teeth were chattering and the knot in my stomach had turned to nausea. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I walked to Tommy Sanders' house, my closest friend since 3rd grade. His mom, Mrs. Sanders, opened the door. Her eyes widened when she saw me, soaked, silent. 16. She didn't ask questions. She pulled me inside, gave me dry clothes from the laundry basket and a plate of eggs that I couldn't eat. Later, when I finally told her everything about my mother's death, the bruises, the woman in the kitchen, she just listened. She didn't gasp. Didn't say, "Are you sure?" She said, "Do you have any family?" I thought of Aunt Ruth, my mother's younger sister. They hadn't spoken often after Ruth moved to Maryland, but I remembered the way she cried at the funeral, the way she looked at my father like she saw through him. Mrs. Sanders handed me the phone. Ruth answered on the 2nd ring. "Elena." Her voice cracked before I said a word. I told her everything. When I finished, she didn't say, "Oh, honey," or "let me think." She said, "I'm coming to get you." 3 hours later, she pulled into the Sanders driveway in a silver Subaru with peeling bumper stickers and tear tracks on her cheeks. She opened the passenger door but didn't rush me. When I climbed in, she took my hand. "We'll figure it out," she said, "and we'll get Lacey. I promise you that." For the first time in days, I let myself exhale, because just one person had said what I'd been trying not to need. "You're not alone." It took me almost a month to go back, not because I didn't want to, but because I needed a plan and someone to stand beside me. That someone was Tom Aunt Ruth's husband. He was a retired firefighter with a soft voice and broad shoulders, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. When I told him what had happened, what was still happening, he didn't hesitate. "We'll get her out," he said. "And if he lays a hand on you again, he'll answer to me." We drove down on a Saturday. Overcast skies, just like the day my mother died. My chest felt hollow, like my heart had forgotten how to stay inside me. We parked a block away from the house. Tom placed a hand on my shoulder. "If anything feels off, we leave." Understood. I nodded, though every part of me was already pulling toward that front door. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Overgrown yard, shutters sagging. That same oak tree out front, its branches still stretching like arms that once held me. I knocked. Cheryl opened the door. Her smile vanished. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here for Lacey." She laughed. "She's not going anywhere." Then Gerald appeared behind her bottle in hand. He looked worse than before, grayer, thinner, but his eyes still held that same old venom. "This is my house," he slurred. "You don't get to make demands." Tom stepped forward, calm, unmoved. "We're not here to fight. We're here to take the girl, that's all." I pushed past them and found Lacey in her room, sitting on the edge of her bed, hugging the same doll Mom had sewn years ago. Her cheek was red, her eyes wider than I remembered. When she saw me, she ran. "You came back," she whispered into my shirt. "Of course I did," I said. "And I'm not leaving without you." We turned to go, but Cheryl was blocking the hallway. "She's lying," she barked. "That kid bruised herself. She's just like her crazy mother." Before I could speak, Lacey said it for me. "You hit me." You hit me when Dad wasn't looking. That was all we needed. Tom stepped forward, and for the first time in my life, I watched my father take a step back. We walked out the front door. No yelling, no dragging, just silence. And as the door closed behind us, I looked up at the oak tree. It hadn't changed, but I had. We didn't go back to North Carolina, not for holidays, not for birthdays, not even when the house was put up for sale a year later. Aunt Ruth enrolled Lacey and me in a small public school outside Annapolis. Tom fixed up the attic so we could each have a little space of our own. It wasn't fancy, but it was quiet. And for the first time in years, I slept without bracing for footsteps in the hallway. Lacey started to laugh again. She made friends, joined the art club, and every night before bed she'd draw something new, a tree, a star, our mother in a blue dress. I didn't know what I wanted, not at first. I just knew I wanted to matter. One day, I found my old notebook in the bottom of a moving box, the one where I'd written down every bruise, every lie, every scream I wasn't supposed to remember. I read it front to back, and then I opened a new one. On the first page, I wrote, "This time I'll speak for the ones who can't." I started community college at 18, transferred to university 2 years later. By 24, I was applying to law school with an essay titled, "The Case No One Took." I didn't write about my father. I didn't name names. But I told the truth. And the truth was this: I wasn't strong because of what he did to me. I was strong because just one person saw me as worth saving. And I wanted to become that person. For someone else. I was 28 when the name came across my desk. Samantha McKee, requesting an emergency protection order, alleging repeated physical and verbal abuse from her husband Thomas Caldwell. I froze. Tom Caldwell, my father. The file was thin, but heavy photos, medical reports, written statements. Everything my mother never had. I took the folder to my supervisor. "Sir," I said, voice steady, "I need to declare a conflict. This man is my biological father." He stared at me for a long second. Then, "You want me to reassign?" I thought of Lacey. I thought of Mom. I thought of Samantha's hollow eyes in the intake photo. "No," I said. "I'd like to stay on." We met in a small conference room. Samantha walked in shoulders tight, hand wrapped in gauze. She flinched when the door clicked behind her. I stood up, extended a hand. "Elena Caldwell," I said. "Legal intern. You're safe here." She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw it. "That same question Mom used to carry, will anyone believe me I used to live with him too?" I added quietly. "Not as a weapon. Just a bridge." Samantha blinked fast, then nodded. "Okay," she said. "Okay." The case wasn't easy. He denied everything, claimed she bruised herself, claimed she made up the threats. But this time, there were documents, witnesses, police reports. I helped her organize every detail just like I used to in my old notebook. 2 weeks later, the judge granted the protective order. Samantha cried in the hallway. Not loud, just a kind of crumpling sound. She turned to me and said, "I don't know how to thank you." "You just did," I replied. I never saw him that day, not in court, not outside. I don't know if he knew I was the one who helped her leave. And I didn't need him to. Somewhere in a dusty box, I still have Mom's apron. Still faintly smells like rosemary and smoke. But I don't wear it. I became something else. Not a daughter, not a victim. Just a witness to what silence costs and someone who chose not to stay quiet. If you've ever found your strength, only after walking away, you don't have to tell the whole story. Just leave one word your mother never heard. Maris's voice broke through the clatter of silverware, sharp and trembling. "We mean nothing to you." Huh. Her eyes welled with tears, her hand clutching the edge of the table as if grief alone would keep her upright. Ophelia leaned forward, chin tight, lips pursed in judgment. "God, Serafina, you're cold. A daughter doesn't treat her family this way." Dorian didn't raise his voice. He never did. Instead, he gave that slow, deliberate shake of his head, the kind that always carried more weight than words. The disappointment in his eyes felt heavier than the sigh that followed. I sat back in my chair, steadying my breath. For years, I had swallowed moments like this. pretending silence was peace. But tonight, their script unraveled. My hand slid into my bag, fingers closing around the phone I had tucked there hours earlier. I drew it out and placed it on the table with deliberate care. Maris sniffled, confusion flashing in her eyes. Ophelia's brows drew together in a tight knot. "Trust me," I said softly. "I care." I pressed play. The room shifted. Familiar voices echoed back Ophelia's sharp critiques about my food. Maris's sighs dripping with disdain. Dorian's casual mutters that I should just let it go. The recording filled every corner, a mirror they couldn't escape. Maris's tears vanished as quickly as they had come. Ophelia's mouth pressed into a thin, brittle line. Dorian's gaze broke, drifting to the floor. I let the silence stretch, then slipped the phone back into my bag. My pulse slowed. Steady now. This wasn't sudden. This had been building for years, and if they wanted to know how I got here, they needed to start where it all began. That memory came rushing back. It started innocently enough. 10 years ago, I offered to host Thanksgiving in my little Asheville home. I was proud of the place hardwood floors I had refinished myself, a dining room just big enough to stretch out a table for 12. I loved filling the air with the scent of rosemary and citrus, hearing laughter spill from the kitchen to the porch. That first holiday, I felt like the glue that held us together. From there, it snowballed. Christmas, Easter, birthdays, even Sunday dinners when someone didn't feel like cooking my house was the venue. At first, I told myself it was love. I didn't mind rising at dawn to baste turkeys or stringing lights until my fingers cramped, seeing everyone gathered around, smiling over a meal I'd poured my energy into, felt worth it. But slowly, things shifted. The thank yous grew shorter, then disappeared. The hugs at the door turned into quick nods. Instead of asking, they began assuming. A message would come from Maris. "We'll be over for dinner on Sunday," not a question, just a fact. Ophelia arrived with her own spices tucked into her purse, ready to fix my recipes. Dorian always sat in his usual chair, never lifting a hand to help, always reminding me with a glance that I had chosen this role. So I should bear it quietly. Even the moments I tried to reclaim suggesting maybe someone else host, or that we go out instead, were brushed aside. "You do it best," Maris would say with a saccharine smile, as if flattery erased the weight of expectation. Year after year, I carried it, waiting for gratitude that never returned. Love became labor, and labor became duty. By the time another Christmas approached, I was already questioning whether my effort meant anything at all. And that year, I would find my breaking point. It didn't matter what I served. Ophelia always found something to needle at. If the soup was too thick, she claimed it lacked refinement. If the bread was crusty, she'd sigh about how her mother's had been softer. Once, after I spent hours making a butternut squash risotto, she wrinkled her nose and muttered, "Heavy food. Serafina, you should think lighter next time." Every word landed like a pinprick, small but sharp enough to sting. Maris had her own way of cutting me down. She didn't criticize outright, at least not with her mother's precision. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, let out a dramatic sigh, and said something like, "Well, I guess this will do." She'd push food around her plate as if she were enduring punishment rather than enjoying a meal I had worked all week to plan. Dorian, of course, never defended me. He just sat at the head of the table, shoulders slouched, chewing slowly. If I ever looked to him for support, he would shrug as though my feelings were too trivial to acknowledge. It was his silence that cut deepest, confirming that in his eyes, I had only one purpose: to keep the machine of family gatherings running. Sometimes the table grew even heavier. Adam, a distant cousin, brought friends without warning faces I didn't know taking seats at my table, helping themselves to food I hadn't prepared with them in mind. The uninvited never apologized. They were simply folded into the evening as if my labor stretched endlessly. Cassian Holt, my neighbor, noticed the rhythm one Sunday when I invited him over for leftovers. "You're too generous." "Serafina," he said, watching me pack food into containers for people who hadn't even thanked me. I laughed it off, insisting it was just family. But his words lingered long after he left, echoing louder with each gathering. The truth was already gnawing at me, even before the Christmas that finally broke me. That December, I tried harder than ever. I told myself that if I could make the evening flawless, maybe it would finally shift something. I spent days planning the menu, choosing each dish with care: a perfectly roasted turkey, citrus-glazed carrots, homemade bread warm from the oven, pies rolled and crimped by hand. I polished the silverware, pressed the linens, and decorated the tree until it looked like something out of a magazine. Every corner of the house sparkled with effort. When the family arrived, they didn't even glance at the work I had poured myself into. "No, thank you. No, wow. This looks beautiful." Just coats tossed over chairs and complaints about the cold. Ophelia's first words were to wrinkle her nose at the mashed potatoes. "You didn't use heavy cream?" she asked, tone sharp as ever. Maris sighed dramatically and slid into her seat. "Guess we'll just have to pretend to like it." "Huh." She glanced at Dorian, who gave one of his usual non-committal shrugs, the silent approval she always sought. Then, as if the moment needed a final blow, Maris strolled into the kitchen, opened my refrigerator, and pulled out a store-bought pumpkin pie I had picked up as a backup. She held it high like a prize and laughed. "Well, at least this will taste good." Ophelia chuckled. Dorian's mouth curved into the faintest grin. Even that tiny betrayal felt like a blade. Something inside me cracked. My heart pounded, my hands trembled, but my voice stayed steady. Without a word, I turned off the oven, unfastened my apron, and walked into the living room. I bent down, unplugged the glowing Christmas tree, and watched the lights die in an instant. The room went still. Forks paused in midair. Maris blinked, startled, her smugness faltering. "What are you doing?" she whispered. I looked at her, then at all of them. "I'm done," I said. "I'm not hosting anymore. Ever." The silence that followed was heavier than all the years of criticism combined, pressing into every corner of the house. And in that silence, I knew there would be no turning back. The silence after my declaration lasted only a breath before Maris's voice rose again, dripping with false sorrow. "So that's it. We mean nothing to you. After everything, you're just going to walk away." Her tears looked rehearsed, her voice too sharp to be genuine. Ophelia gasped, one hand flying to her chest as if I'd struck her. "How could you say that? Serafina, we're your family. You don't just quit family." Even Dorian, who so often hid behind his silence, finally spoke. "Cold," he muttered, shaking his head. "How could you be so cold?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. After years of biting remarks, uninvited guests, and endless labor that went unnoticed, I was the one branded unfeeling. Their outrage wasn't about losing me, it was about losing their convenience. I straightened, the weight of decision settling comfortably on my shoulders. "You think I don't care?" I said evenly. "But trust me, I care enough to keep receipts." Their brows knit in confusion as I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. My thumb tapped the screen, and a familiar chorus filled the room. Ophelia's condescending tone. "You didn't use heavy cream." "Well, that's different." Maris's mocking sigh. "I guess we'll just have to pretend to like it." Dorian's careless murmur. "Just let it go." Serafina. Each word echoed louder than the last, undeniable and inescapable. The color drained from Maris's face. Ophelia's lips pressed so tightly they nearly disappeared. Dorian looked away, eyes fixed on the floor. I let the recording play until the final Smug laughter faded. Then I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked at them one by one. Still think I'm cold. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, a reminder that dinner still sat waiting, untouched. I walked to the closet, pulled my coat from its hanger, and slid it on with a deliberate calm. My hands no longer shook. My pulse was steady, almost serene. At the doorway, I paused just long enough to say, "Dinner's in the fridge. Help yourselves." Then I stepped outside, the night air sharp against my skin, and closed the door behind me. For the first time in years, I left them to face the silence without me, and I didn't look back. The messages started that same night, Maris demanding an explanation, Ophelia insisting we needed to talk, Dorian's short, clipped lines reminding me of duty. I ignored every one of them. When the calls came, I let them ring out. Silence was my only reply, and it unsettled them more than any words could have. Weeks passed. Christmas ended without me, and for the first time in a decade, they were forced to fend for themselves. I heard pieces of it through whispers that reached me in town. The turkey was undercooked. Maris forgot to defrost the pies. Ophelia snapped at Dorian in front of everyone, her voice carrying sharp enough to quiet the table. By New Year's, they were already frayed. Easter was worse. Maris attempted to host, declaring she'd do it better than Serafina ever did. Instead, she burned the ham, overcooked the vegetables, and watched as Ophelia tore into her in front of cousins and neighbors. Maris, always dramatic, ended the night in tears, telling everyone she'd never host again. The fractures spread quickly. Ophelia took her turn, trying to show she was still the matriarch who could hold it all together. She forgot to set the table properly, and Dorian muttered about it within earshot of the guests. Maris mocked her cooking with the same biting tone she once used on me. What once was casual cruelty toward me became weapons they turned on each other. I didn't lift a finger. I spent those months pouring energy into my work, walking by the river in the evenings, even sharing coffee with Cassian now and then. One afternoon, when I told him about the messages I still ignored, he smiled faintly and said, "You taught them respect by absence. Sometimes silence is louder than any fight." And he was right. For once, they were forced to see what life looked like without me holding everything together. It didn't stop them from trying to pull me back in, though. The first attempt came on a gray afternoon, when Ophelia reached out with an invitation of her own. Ophelia chose a small cafe downtown, one of those places with chipped teacups and quiet corners. She was already there when I arrived, stirring her tea with slow, practiced grace. Her smile was too sweet, her eyes sharp as glass. "Thank you for coming," she began, as if I had agreed to something noble. I only nodded, waiting. She wasted no time. "I was thinking, maybe you could host Christmas again this year. I know you needed a break, but you've had time now, haven't you?" I almost laughed. After everything, she was still framing it as if hosting was a privilege she bestowed on me. "No," I said simply. Her smile froze. A flicker of something ugly crossed her face before she smoothed it over. "Serafina, we're family, and family makes sacrifices. The children always loved coming to your house." Her voice softened on that last part, a needle meant to pierce my heart. I leaned forward. "I sacrificed enough. I cooked, cleaned, decorated, and listened to all of you insult me. I don't owe you another holiday." Her lips pressed thin. She muttered something about misunderstanding, then quickly changed the subject, pretending we were just catching up. I let her, but I knew the game wasn't over. That night, Dorian came home pale, asking why I'd been so cruel to her. Apparently, Ophelia had called him crying, spinning the meeting into another tale of my coldness. I didn't argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone, opened the recording I'd made at the cafe, and pressed play. Her own voice filled the room. Family means sacrifice. The children loved your house. Every manipulative note rang clear. Dorian sank into his chair, silent. Ophelia's mask had cracked again, and yet, even stripped bare, she wasn't finished. I knew something was wrong the moment I pulled into the driveway. Ophelia's car sat crooked near the porch. Maris's sedan pressed close behind it. The blinds in the front window were parted just enough to tell me they'd been watching for me. When I opened the door, the three of them were already seated in my living room as if they owned it. Maris perched on the edge of the couch, eyes red but defiant. Ophelia sat with her legs crossed, hands folded in her lap like a queen on her throne. Dorian lingered in the armchair, his shoulders heavy, his face unreadable. "We can't keep doing this," Maris started, her voice wavering. "You're punishing us. Punishing you." I set my bag down, my voice flat. "For what? For having to host your own dinners." Ophelia leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "You're tearing this family apart. All because you don't want to do your part anymore." I laughed once, cold and short. My part. For a decade I carried every holiday, every meal, every insult you threw my way. And now you call it punishment when I stop. Dorian shifted uneasily. "Serafina, please. Can't we just move on from this?" I stood straighter, looking at each of them in turn. "No, I will never host again. Ever." The words landed like stones, heavy and final. Maris's mouth fell open, a small gasp escaping. Ophelia's composure cracked, her jaw tightening, her fingers gripping her knee. Even Dorian lowered his gaze, the weight of inevitability sinking in. For the first time in years, I felt the balance tip away from their control, and as I looked around my own living room, I realized it was time to reclaim it for good. The day after their ambush, I walked through my house and saw it differently. The oversized dining table, once stretched to fit every demand, suddenly looked more like a monument to years of exhaustion than a piece of furniture. The cabinets lined with serving platters and dishes felt less like tools of hospitality and more like chains that had bound me to a role I no longer wanted. So I began to let go. I called the local donation center and arranged for the platters and extra sets of china to be picked up. When the men carried them out, I felt lighter, as though each piece they removed took a bit of weight off my chest. Then I listed the dining table for sale. A young couple came to see it, their eyes bright at the thought of hosting their first Thanksgiving. I handed it over without a second thought, happy to see it belong to someone who still carried hope instead of obligation. In its place, I bought a small round table just enough for 4. On its first night, I invited Cassian and 2 close friends from work. We shared simple food, laughed easily, and lingered long after the plates were cleared. No criticism, no guilt, no unspoken debts. For the first time, joy sat at my table instead of duty. As the night wound down, I realized my home finally reflected me, not the version my family demanded. And in that quiet freedom, I began to see the outline of who I was becoming. But peace, once found, doesn't mean others stop trying to steal it. Months passed, and the rhythm of life shifted. The Vales stopped calling as often, though their silence carried a bitterness I could almost taste. From neighbors and mutual acquaintances, I heard small pieces of their unraveling. Ophelia sulked through gatherings she attempted to host, her perfectionism met with indifference. Maris complained loudly to anyone who would listen about the burden of responsibility she claimed I had abandoned. Dorian retreated into quiet resignation, fading into the background the same way he always had. Meanwhile, I thrived. My home, stripped of its old demands, became a place of peace. I filled weekends with dinners among friends, evenings walking along the French Broad River, mornings spent in quiet reflection with a book and coffee. The air felt lighter without the constant weight of expectation pressing down on me. Sometimes I thought of the old days, of the decade I had given away to keep their world running smoothly. The laughter I chased, the gratitude I hoped for, the validation that never came. I realized how much of myself I had set on fire just to keep them warm. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the river in shades of gold, I stopped at the overlook and let the breeze move through me. My life was no longer defined by their demands, their criticisms, or their entitlement. I was free, finally, irrevocably free. I spent years burning to keep them warm. I whispered to the water, steady and certain, never again. In the end, is family defined by those who share your name or those who honor your worth?